Shabbat Shalom. One day, Sigmund Freud went for a walk in the Italian Alps in the company of a young poet named Rainer Maria Rilke. As they walked through what Freud described as the blossoming summer landscape, surrounded by colorful flowers and dancing butterflies, Freud noticed that his young companion was strangely morose. He wrote, "The poet admired the beauty of the scene around us, but he felt no joy in it. He was disturbed by the thought that all this beauty was fated to extinction, that it would vanish when winter came, like all human beauty and all the beauty and splendor that men have created or may create." Freud wrote about this experience in a short essay called On Transience that he wrote in 1916 when he was 60 years old himself. The world was at war then. His two sons were away in the army, and he saw civilization collapsing around him. Yet he speaks not about his own despair, but about Rilke, who could not enjoy the pleasures of a summer day because he knew that winter was on its way. Towards the end of the essay, Freud describes a phenomenon that he called anticipatory mourning. His companion, he said, felt his enjoyment of beauty interfered with by thoughts of its transience. In other words, Rilke's thoughts were so tied to the future that they robbed him of the joy that he could have experienced in the present. Anticipatory mourning means that we so fear experiencing loss in a time to come that we resist investing ourselves in the here and now. As I read the story, I couldn't help but think about how often people live this way, with anticipatory mourning. How often people are partly there, distracted by something, retreading or redigesting the past, or perhaps jumping ahead and worrying about the future and whether and what the future might bring. We do this especially during periods of uncertainty, when there are no clear indications of how things will turn out. We project ourselves constantly and anxiously into the future. Our minds buzz with questions. Will this treatment work? Will the pains in my body lessen? Will my loved one get better? Will we work out our marital issues? Will my child ever be motivated? Will my husband be able to maintain his job? Will my daughter ever marry? Will the economy turn? Will my retirement savings run out? Will I ever have a positive relationship with my daughter-in-law? Will I ever have grandchildren? Who, if anyone, will take care of me when I can't take care of myself? These are just some of the many questions that so many of us ask ourselves and worry about. And the challenge is recognizing that every one of these questions depends on factors that are simply beyond our control. Each question takes us into a time and a place that we cannot possibly know until we get there. It's hard to control our reflexes, though. It seems to be somewhat instinctive. Once we're in the midst of a troubling, unresolved situation, we tend to return again and again to envisioning possible outcomes. There's a Jewish story from the collection of absurdities that happens in a place called Chelm. The story goes like this. The residents of Helm, who are notorious for their foolishness, they used to spend a good deal of time worrying. They spent so much time worrying, in fact, that soon they began to worry about just how much time they worried. So the Grand Council of Wise Men from the place of Helm convened a meeting. And in their meeting, they wanted to discuss all this worrying, and they wanted to find a solution for it. For 7 days and 7 nights, the wise men of Helm deliberated on their problem, until finally the chairperson announced a solution. Yassel, the chimney sweeper, would be designated to be the official Helm warrior. In return for 1 ruble a week, he would be in charge of doing all of the worrying for all of the people in Helm. The Grand Council members all agreed, and everyone was happy with their plan. This, they thought, was surely the ideal solution. However, right before the vote was taken, one of the sages rose up on his feet to speak against the proposal. "Wait a minute," he said. "If Yassel's going to receive 1 ruble a week, then what will he have to worry about?" Meaning, even about not worrying, they worried. This story describes the ancient Jewish tradition of prophylactic worrying. The belief that by worrying enough and worrying hard enough and long enough, we can ward off any future problems and prevent bad things from happening. A few years ago, there was a study that showed that worrying might actually be genetic. The study was done at Yale, and the researchers found and identified a gene mutation for what they call rumination, the chronic tendency to fret and obsess over negative thoughts. They acknowledge that the regular run-of-the-mill worriers tend to lose sleep over possible problems in the future, while ruminators tend to brood over the past. Perhaps we might be bound to struggle, but an enormous toll is taken on us, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, when we worry. The truth is that while gratitude and joy bring us closer to God, when we feel sad or anxious or distracted or physically or emotionally drained or down, we oftentimes find ourselves estranged from others and estranged from God. And it's hard to find the blessings and the beauty in the world around us. In this week's Torah portion, Bishalach, we read about this sort of worrying. The Israelites we read in our Torah portion are just beside themselves. God has just liberated them from Egyptian slavery. God has just parted the waters of the Red Sea for them and allowed them to run through in safety. And 3 days later, what do we find them doing? Worrying. We find them actually in an incredibly anxious state because they have found themselves without water. They finally arrive in a place called Marah, and they find water that they can drink, but the water is so bitter that they cannot enjoy it, and the Israelites start to have a meltdown. They cry out in fear that they might never find water and that they can die. They are terrified. Flight, fight, or freeze. They fight. And 10 days later, they do the whole thing all over again, this time over food. They're so worried, they're so anxious, and they're so terrified that they can't get that the incredibly powerful and compassionate God that just rescued them, that just created miracle after miracle after miracle for them, is actually going to stick with them, that they are actually going to be okay, and that God is going to make sure of it. But they can't get that. They can't let go of their worrying and their fear, and they can't get themselves to a place of trust and faith. So God tells them, and God shows us in this Torah portion, that they are bound to take a circuitous route from Egyptian slavery into the promised land. It wasn't as a punishment for not having faith and trust. It wasn't that at all. It was because God knows and God recognizes that faith and trust are hard, that faith and trust take time to foster, because it doesn't come easily to us, because our instinct is to worry and to fear. It's easy to look at the generation of slaves and to say, were they crazy? They were constantly kvetching. What's wrong with these people? They just witnessed the most extraordinary of miracles. God just intervened for them again and again. And what did they say? I wish I had died in Egypt. It's too awful out here to continue. But Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel has a beautiful insight when he says, no, you can't think that. Because if you do, you are wrong. They had every right to kvetch and to complain when there was no water and there was no food. Be their great miracles of history, they matter. But so does being able to give water to your child when they are thirsty. And so does it matter to be able to consume food when you are hungry. And we, said Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, make a terrible mistake if we look at these people as faithless simply because they cry out to God. In fact, what they're doing is a form of spiritual excellence. Being able to cry out to God is a beautiful thing. What do you do? What do you do when you can't let go of the worries? What do you do when you hold on to the anxiety? What do you do when you miss out on today because you're so worried about tomorrow or so consumed by the past? Our Torah portion today, in the examples of Freud and Rilke, and also the foolish people of Chelm, it teaches us that we need to work on our bitachon, that we need to work on our faith and our trust, that we need to recognize that we need to make the best choices we can possibly make and do everything within our power. And then we also have to recognize that so much is out of our control. And we need to share the burden and the responsibility with God. We need to trust and have faith that things will work out as they are meant to. And when we can find and when we can access and when we can hold on to that bitachon, that trust and that faith, we will be able to live healthier, better, and happier lives. We will be able to take a step forward just as the Israelites could do then, and to find our more promised land. May it be for us, just as it was for our ancestors. May we find our faith, our trust in the world, in God, and in tomorrow. And may we find our promised land together. Shabbat Shalom.